Revenge of the Black Cloak Society, a King's Quest-based fic. Chapter 4. Bewitching the Throne. King Alexander of the Green Isles paced the throne room of his castle. The sudden cut-off from his parents had worried him, even after it took all that time to get a hold of them. There was a very dark magic surrounding his homeland of Daventry, and what made it worse was who might be involved. The way it looked, the head of the Black Cloak Society was behind this attack. It was as if all of the evil was targeting them. He finally sat back down in his throne and went over what it meant in his head. Shamir Shamazel, the jinn he freed from the servitude of Abdul al-Hazred, looked at him, and Alexander could see concern in the jinn's face. He looked up at the jinn just as Shamir spoke. "Things are very bad. If that dark magic stopped my spell." Alexander just nodded. "They are indeed. It seems the very head of the Black Cloak Society is beginning his strike. He has somehow resurrected the evil witch my father defeated." A gasp from Shamir made Alexander worry more about the whole situation. "Shamir, what would it take to do that?" He watched as the jinn looked around the room for a moment before finally speaking. In his voice he could hear fear. "Very dark magic. Such magic costs lives to perform. Someone would also have to be very old to know it." Those words made Alexander worry even more. Ever since he realized he had been abducted, and then later discovered how Mananan, Mordrak, and Abdul were all linked, he feared that there were more dark wizards that would attempt something. He didn't think the leader of the group would attempt an attack. Now, that attack had come, and it was on his family back in Daventry. His worries were broken for a moment when Saladin, the captain of the guard, entered the room. In the mystical kingdom of the Green Isles, Saladin wasn't an unusual sight with his canine appearance. Alexander looked up at the guard. "Saladin, have you found out anything more from Abdul?" The gruff voice of the guard fit with the news that he told. "Not much, sire. We still don't know all the members, but we have learned something about the members that have been defeated. Abdul, as well as Lucretio, were on the lowest level of the inner circle. Apparently, members without magical powers of their own don't get far in the inner circle. Hagatha, Mordrak, and the lot whom your sister defeated are a level above Abdul. Just above them were Mananan, who had abducted you, Dahlia, the witch your father defeated, and Militia. They basically are of advanced age and had very destructive plans. Finally, all he'll tell us about the leader is that his name is Shadrach." Alexander sighed, and then stood up. "So nothing new has been learned." That didn't need to be said, but he did learn something. Whomever Shadrach was, he was very powerful and had the potential to be very dangerous. He had heard about what the other members of the Black Cloak Society had pulled, and he knew that Shadrach must have something very dangerous planned. "Have we heard any word from either the Oracle or the Druids?" Before Saladin could answer, another of the guards opened the door and shouted, "Princess Celeste of the Isle of the Sacred Mountain, to speak with His Royal Highness." Both he and Saladin turned to face the winged princess. Her stance was the same when he first encountered her, but she had humbled after he had restored peace amongst the Green Isles. She finally bowed and calmly said, "Your Highness, The oracle has asked me to relay a message to you. She says that many dark clouds are on the horizon, and that many lives may be lost before they clear. Alexander let the words sink in. The oracle had told him that when he was trying to help Cassima, that he would never leave the Green Isles. She had been right, even through her words, even though her words could have had an ominous tone. Now, even though it wasn't the oracle saying them, they held a dark meaning. Thank you, Princess Celeste. I would like you to relay a message to your father. Tell King Azure that I wish to speak with him about something. After the Winged One left, he turned to Saladin and Shamir. Get word to the leaders of the other isles. They must be informed that I might need one of them to watch over things here. I shall be heading to Daventry once Shamir can get through the dark magic there. He watched as both left the room. Saladin through the door, and Shamir disappearing in a puff of smoke. He then hoped things would be fine until he got to Daventry. Crispin sat in his room and toiled over a crystal ball. Ever since Derek's accident, a dark cloud seemed to be hanging over Daventry. Part of him even hoped that whenever Derek recovered would mean the end of the dark days. However, there was one thing that he worried about, and that was contacting the original historian. Derek's home was in Ludor, and was the very house that Manannan lived in. If dark magic was behind all the things happening now, then maybe trying to contact the house won't be difficult. His efforts were rewarded when the image of Derek's face appeared in the crystal ball. Crispin smiled when he saw the middle-aged face. "Derek, it is good to see you again. I hope you are recovering from what sent you there." He watched as a weak smile crossed Derek's face. "I fear it may be a while until I am able to return. I do thank you for letting Cedric stay with me. However, there are a few odd things happening in Ludor." Crispin suddenly felt worried. With the return of Dahlia, any news of something odd caused him to worry. He looked at the historian through the crystal ball and asked, "What sort of odd things?" He watched as Derek looked around, as if the man were being watched, and finally spoke. "It is the oddest thing, but the eye that Manannan had has gone dark. There have also been reports that more Gorgons have appeared in the desert." Crispin felt his concern for Ludor rising. He had thought only one Gorgon had existed in Ludor, and that Alexander had turned it to stone. Word that there were more didn't set well. "I hope that is the only thing." He was upset when Derek shook his head. "Cedric has said that he saw the bandits starting up their activities again in Port Bruce. They had been in the employment of Manannan, and never fully disbanded after his transformation. In fact, they had gotten several of his ingredients for him. Also, I think something is happening in his old lab. Shortly after Cedric and I arrived here, I heard a strange bubbling sound, as if he was brewing a potion, but that can't be possible." Crispin repressed a shudder when he heard that. Wizards never dared enter another wizard's lair. It was an unspoken rule, and even evil wizards respected it. There were only two ways another person could enter a wizard's lair. One was that they were non-magical, as Alexander had been able to do when he did it. The other was if they had been given permission, which was entirely possible, since no one had seen Manannan since Mordak's defeat. He quickly stopped that train of thought and looked at Derek. "Thank you for the info, my friend. Hopefully, you'll be able to return soon." He waved to Derek, and the image faded from the crystal ball. Once the image was gone, Crispin started to pace. All along, Graham had feared the Black Cloak Society would attack. Now it appeared that it was happening, and it might be on more than Daventry. That made Crispin wonder if Shadrach had reached Daventry, or sent one of his minions. It could not be possible for the Dark Wizard to be in two places at once. At least, that's what Crispin believed. No matter what he believed, Crispin knew he had to inform Graham about what he had learned. He quickly left his room and headed in the direction of the throne room. He just hoped he could figure out what was happening before anything worse could happen. King Graham paced the throne room of Castle Daventry. It was one of the few rooms left he could do that in right now. Much of the castle had been crowded with most of Daventry's citizens. He first issued the order when the dragon had been sighted. Now the order included the mountain area, since the giant had returned to the land of the clouds. The land of the clouds was a mystical part of Daventry, where clouds surrounded a magical cliff. Once the giant had left when Graham claimed the crown, many citizens started to attempt to set up homes there. Then, when the new dragon had shown up, people fled. Eventually, when Alexander returned, the area became inhabitable again. Now, the peace that had come about was gone again. It was replaced with panic and fear. Was this what the Black Cloak Society wanted? For everyone in Daventry, or even the world, to be in turmoil? If that was the case, they seemed to be succeeding. However, he had to remain strong. At this time, his people needed him to be strong. He stopped pacing when he heard the throne room door open. He turned to face whomever entered the room, and was relieved to see Crispin. However, there was a concerned look on Crispin's face that told him there was more to worry about than Daventry. He sat down in the throne and sat back. "What have you found out?" Crispin looked around for a moment before he spoke. "I have spoken with Derek. It appears bad things are not just happening in Daventry. Ludor, where Manannan had Alexander, is starting to show signs that someone is starting things up again. All signs even point to Manannan returning." Graham stood up in complete shock of the words. "That's not possible. I remember leaving him in a burlap sack in his brother's castle. Didn't you ever find that sack?" He was stunned when Crispin nodded. "I did find it, still sealed, but when I opened it, it was empty. It felt like Manannan might have been dead. However, he wasn't even there. To be honest, I had thought he tried to escape using some sort of magic, and it failed. I tried once to even scry for him, but maybe his cat form prevents scrying." Graham started to walk around the throne. The idea that Manannan was still around worried him. Apparently, just in cat form, he could still be a problem. When Graham rescued his family from Mordrak, the cat had tried to stop him. However, something made him wonder. "Crispin, are you sure Manannan can't cast magic in cat form?" The old wizard just shook his head. "I'm unsure, sire. All signs would point to him not being able to use magic, but someone else could be doing it for him." Graham took that info in and realized that it was possible that Shadrach was doing things in Ludor. If that was the case, then Shadrach might not be in Daventry. But if that was true, then how could all these things be happening? Unless Shadrach was so powerful that he could work his magic over countless miles, there was no way he could be in both places at once. His thoughts were interrupted when he heard the door open again. His first hope was that Valanice was entering the throne room. The more disaster struck, the more he worried about her. His worries didn't cease when he saw that it was Cale Silver, the new historian, entering. Graham looked over at the historian, figuring the historian might have had some questions about how all this tied into his original quest for the crown. Right now, with all going on, he couldn't talk about that. "Is there a reason you are here, Cale?" He watched as the new historian only nodded. "Yes, sire. Queen Valanice wanted you to know that she is lying in a room." Hearing that, he wondered if this is another part of the Black Cloak Society's actions. Before he could ask why, Cale just sighed. "I think that the whole ordeal has taken a toll on her. She complained about a headache and needed to lie down." Graham nodded in understanding. The stress of the events were very overpowering. He even thought of joining her, but right now he needed to be here. His people needed him to be strong. However, part of him still worried about Dahlia and Shadrach. He turned to one of the guards. "I want a guard posted outside the room. If my wife cries for help, they are to rush to her aid." The guard nodded and left the room. Graham felt relieved and also apprehensive. He wondered if he was being paranoid about everything, but for some reason, he felt that it would be needed. Inwardly, however, he hoped he was wrong. Dahlia stood by her cauldron and stirred it. She was working on a special spell, and in a few hours it would be ready. It would be a special version of her standard spell for taking care of trespassers. It was all part of the plan, and she was going to make sure she got rid of the King and Queen of Daventry. Daventry was already in shambles, and the death of the royal family would destroy it. Even better, it would help Shadrach's plans. For countless years, the Black Cloak Society had a master plan in effect. Until her defeat years ago, the only obstacle had been Daventry. Now she had the chance to undo all that Graham had done. As she toiled over the cauldron, she heard the approach of footsteps. She stopped stirring the mixture and turned to face the person who had entered. Since she finally gotten used to the body the girl had, she decided to dress a bit younger. The look distracted some of the male trespassers long enough for her to capture them, or for one of her minions to do it. She wasn't surprised to see it was the sorcerer. She glanced at him and finally spoke. "What have you found out?" The blank stare disguised the sharp mind behind them. "The giant is destroying the last of the homes in the cloud area. Some homes that were on the edge have been burned to the ground by the dragon. Lastly, Shadrach sent word that the time is right to snatch up the queen." Dahlia smiled when she heard that. "Good. The spell will soon be ready for her. I shall fetch her. I want you, the ogre, and the wolf to guard the house. Until the spell is complete, the place will need protection." She watched as the sorcerer nodded in understanding. It was good to have minions with no free will of their own. She stepped outside with her broom in hand and quickly took to the air. In a few moments she would be above the treetops. Once that happened, she might be seen, and they would hide Valnice away. She quickly muttered an ancient spell. When she reached the treetops, the sky began to darken. She gave a brief glance at the sun and briefly saw a shadow being cast over it. As the sky darkened, Dahlia flew towards shadow that Castle Daventry. She was used to being in darkness since Graham killed her original body. During those long years, she was a shade and lived in darkness. After the first year, she could see all details about anything in the dark. She could even see the detail of every room that had a window. However, she wasn't sure which window was the one Valnice was in. As she hovered in the air for a moment, she looked over the windows again and noticed movement. She smiled and neared the window. In a matter of moments, she would have the last part of her spell ready, and when it reaches completion, everyone in the castle, with the exception of Shadrach, would be turned into cookies. She started to cackle, and then flew straight at the window containing her prey. Queen Valnice laid quietly on the bed and had her eyes closed. It was all part of her method of relaxing to ease the pain in her head. With the stress of everything happening, she was developing a headache. At least, that's what she hoped it was. It had developed shortly after she had been talking with Kale Silver about her homeland, Kalima. She started to focus on her homeland. She wondered how things had been. A few years ago, long after Graham rescued her, she had received word that her parents were dead. That meant that her brother Frederick was now in control of the kingdom. She started to envy him for that. All he seemed to have to deal with was the dwindling vampire population that terrorized the land at night. Just thinking about the terror that they and Hagatha, who had kidnapped her, caused, made her open her eyes. However, she didn't expect them to be greeted by darkness. She quickly sat up and looked around. It was so dark nothing could be seen. She quickly got up and moved in the direction of the door. As she neared the door, she heard panicked people in the hall outside. People in the castle were panicking, which told her that dark magic was involved in this. She knew that right now what her people needed was for her to be with them. She reached the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. This made her worry. Valnice tried to open the door again. When it still held fast, she started to pound on the door. She stopped pounding on the door when she heard a wicked cackle. For a moment she thought back to when Hagatha had abducted her. It had been under a cover of darkness years ago. She couldn't move, and no one could help her. And then she had seen the face of Hagatha, the hideous face that had made her freeze up with fear. All that happened years ago, and Valnice felt it was happening again. Her fears were justified when she went to move and couldn't. She was like a statue, and she was facing the window. She tried to brace herself for the hideous face of the old witch. However, when she saw Dahlia, she felt a new fear. She watched as the witch slowly flew in the window. Even in the darkness she could see that the witch had a young body. The closer the witch got, the more she realized who the witch was. It had to be the young lady who had disappeared. She didn't remember ever seeing the woman before, but now she would never forget what the woman looked like. When Dahlia was close enough to Valnice, she saw her toss a scroll onto the bed. She tried to say something, but her mouth wouldn't move. Dahlia just looked at her and smirked. "Don't worry, Valenice. You won't be able to speak until we get back to my lair. I want to be able to hear you scream when I transform you and all the people in the castle into cookies." Valenice was horrified at the idea. All the people in Daventry turned into cookies. It would be like the time everyone in Daventry was turned to stone, except now there might be no escape. She then felt the witch somehow lift her up. She was now levitating as Dahlia turned her broom around and flew out the window. Valenice watched as the floor of the room flew past her, and then the ground and the moat below her as she flew outside. She also noticed that the darkness was lifting. It was almost like her abduction years ago. However, this time, if she wasn't rescued, all of Daventry would die. That made this time much, much worse.